It's May 27, 1941, and the crew of the German battleship Bismarck knows they're going to die. Their ship's rudder is jammed, steering stuck, circling helplessly in the Atlantic while the entire British fleet closes in for the kill. Just 4 days ago, Bismarck was the pride of the German Navy, seemingly invincible, having destroyed the British battlecruiser Hood in minutes. Now they're dead in the water with no escape. But here's the question nobody asks enough. Could Bismarck have survived? Were there decisions made during those 4 days that sealed her fate? What if the rudder hadn't jammed? What if different tactical choices had been made? Today we're going to examine the hunt for the Bismarck and explore whether this legendary battleship could have made it home, or whether she was doomed from the moment she left port. Let's start at the beginning, because understanding why Bismarck was out there in the first place is crucial for understanding whether survival was even possible. In May 1941, Germany's strategic situation at sea was difficult. The German surface fleet was tiny compared to the British Royal Navy. The British had dozens of battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers. Germany had a handful of capital ships. The German Navy's strategy was called commerce raiding. Send fast, powerful ships into the Atlantic to attack British merchant convoys. Force the British to spread their fleet thin, protecting shipping lanes. Sink enough merchant ships and Britain, which depended on imports for survival, might be starved into submission. Operation Regenboog, also known as Exercise, was designed around this strategy. The plan was to send Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen into the Atlantic, where they'd hunt British convoys. Bismarck was perfect for this mission, or so German planners thought. She was fast, heavily armored, and mounted 8 15-inch guns that could destroy any merchant ship and threaten most warships. The idea was that Bismarck and Prince Eugen would break out into the Atlantic, avoid major British fleet units, attack convoys, and then return to port before the British could concentrate enough force to stop them. On paper, it was a reasonable plan. In execution, everything went wrong. The first problem was that the British knew Bismarck was coming. British intelligence, including reports from Norwegian resistance and reconnaissance flights, detected Bismarck and Prince Eugen leaving Norwegian waters. The British Admiralty immediately ordered its ships to intercept. The element of surprise was lost before Bismarck even reached open ocean. This was critical because the entire commerce raiding strategy depended on entering the Atlantic undetected, hitting targets before the British could respond, and disappearing again. With the British alerted, Bismarck was being hunted from the start. Second problem was the Battle of the Denmark Strait on May 24th. British ships, the battlecruiser Hood and the battleship Prince of Wales, intercepted Bismarck and Prince Eugen in the narrow waters between Iceland and Greenland. The ensuing battle was brief and catastrophic for the British. Hood exploded and sank in minutes, killing all but 3 of her 1,400 crew. The Prince of Wales was damaged and forced to break off. It looked like a stunning German victory. Bismarck had destroyed the pride of the Royal Navy and escaped with only minor damage. But that minor damage was the beginning of the end. During the battle, Bismarck took 3 hits from the Prince of Wales. One of these seemingly minor hits ruptured a fuel tank, causing an oil leak. This single shell hit doomed Bismarck. The fuel leak meant Bismarck couldn't reach her intended destinations in the Atlantic. She didn't have enough fuel to operate as a commerce raider and then return to port. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, the commander of the operation, made a fateful decision. Instead of turning back immediately, he decided to continue south toward France, where Bismarck could be repaired. This decision gave the British time to hunt her down. Here's where we need to ask the first what-if question. What if Lütjens had turned back immediately after the Denmark Strait battle? Bismarck was still fast, still combat-capable. The British were shocked and disorganized after the loss of Hood. If Bismarck had turned north immediately, heading back toward Norway, could the British have stopped her? The answer is probably not. The British ships in the area were scattered and damaged. Bismarck could have outrun pursuit and made it to Norwegian waters, where German air cover could protect her. But Lutyens didn't know how badly the British had been hurt. He didn't know that turning back immediately was his best option. He made a reasonable decision based on incomplete information that turned out to be wrong. The chase that followed became one of the most dramatic naval hunts in history. The British mobilized everything they had: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and even ships that were escorting convoys were pulled off their assignments to join the hunt. Churchill himself was personally following the operation, sending messages demanding that Bismarck be sunk. The British national mood after the loss of Hood was a mixture of shock and fury. Hood had been a symbol of British naval power. Her loss had to be avenged. The British were going to sink Bismarck no matter what it took. But for a while, it looked like Bismarck might escape. On the night of May 24th, British ships lost contact. Bismarck turned southeast toward France, and the British lost track of her for crucial hours. If Bismarck had maintained this heading and speed, she would have reached the safety of French ports and German air cover. The British were searching in the wrong areas. They were running low on fuel. Some British ships would have to break off the chase soon, or they'd run out of fuel themselves. Bismarck was getting away. Then the Germans made a critical mistake. Admiral Lutyens sent a long radio message back to Germany reporting on the operation and his intentions. British direction-finding stations picked up this transmission and triangulated Bismarck's approximate position. The British now knew where to look. This radio transmission, completely unnecessary from an operational security standpoint, gave the British the information they needed to continue the hunt. Some historians consider this one of the most consequential mistakes of the entire chase. If Lutyens had maintained radio silence, Bismarck probably would have made it to France. But he didn't, and the British found her again. On the morning of May 26th, a British Catalina flying boat spotted Bismarck. The British now knew exactly where she was and that she was heading for France. But there was a problem. Most British ships were too far away to catch her before she reached air cover. Bismarck was going to escape unless something slowed her down. That something was the aircraft carrier Ark Royal and her squadron of Swordfish torpedo bombers. These aircraft were obsolete by 1941 standards, slow biplanes that seemed out of place in World War. But they were about to change history. The first Swordfish attack on the afternoon of May 26th failed. The pilots attacked the wrong ship, the British cruiser Sheffield that was shadowing Bismarck, though fortunately they didn't damage her. But a second attack launched in the early evening succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. One torpedo hit Bismarck's stern, jamming her rudder. This was the death blow. With her rudder jammed, Bismarck couldn't steer. She could only circle helplessly. All her speed, all her armor, all her firepower meant nothing if she couldn't control where she was going. The British fleet was closing in, and Bismarck couldn't run. Now we need to ask a crucial question. Could Bismarck's crew have fixed the rudder damage? This is one of the great what-ifs of the entire chase. The damage was catastrophic, but was it irreparable? German damage control crews tried everything. They sent divers over the side in heavy seas to examine the damage. They tried to use the propellers to steer by varying the speed of the engines. They considered flooding certain compartments to change the ship's trim and hopefully influence steering. None of it worked. The torpedo had hit in the worst possible place, jamming the rudder at a 15-degree angle. Engineering solutions that might have worked in a calm harbor were impossible in heavy Atlantic seas with the ship under constant threat. Some historians have speculated that if Bismarck had had more time, if she could have drifted for several days while repairs were attempted, the damage might have been manageable. But she didn't have time. British battleships were hours away and they were coming in for the kill. The question becomes, what if that torpedo had missed? Or what if it had hit somewhere else, anywhere else, and not jammed the rudder? If Bismarck had maintained steering, could she have made it to France? The answer is almost certainly yes. She was less than a day from air cover. The British ships chasing her were running low on fuel. If Bismarck had kept moving toward France, she would have made it. The final battle on the morning of May 27th was less a battle and more an execution. British battleships King George V and Rodney closed to point-blank range and pounded Bismarck with hundreds of shells. Bismarck fought back initially, but her fire control was quickly knocked out. She became a floating wreck, still afloat, because of her heavy armor, but unable to fight effectively. The British fired over 2,800 shells at Bismarck. She absorbed an incredible amount of punishment, but kept floating. Finally, the British fired torpedoes, and Bismarck capsized and sank. Of her crew of over 2,200 men, only 115 survived. Let's examine what Bismarck's armor and design tell us about her survivability. Bismarck was designed with survivability in mind. Her armor scheme was comprehensive, with thick belt armor, armored decks, and compartmentalization to limit flooding. In theory, Bismarck could take enormous punishment and keep fighting, and in practice, she did. The final battle proved that her armor worked. British shells at close range couldn't penetrate her citadel, the armored core protecting her magazines and machinery. The British couldn't actually sink Bismarck with gunfire alone. They wrecked her superstructure, killed her crew, destroyed her ability to fight, but they couldn't sink her through the armor. Only torpedoes hitting below the waterline finally sent her under. This raises an interesting point. If Bismarck's armor was that good, why didn't it save her? The answer is that armor doesn't matter if you can't move. Bismarck's vulnerability wasn't due to her armor scheme or design. It was the single torpedo hit that jammed her rudder. That was a case of luck combined with design vulnerability. Modern warship rudders are critical single-point failures. Lose steering, and nothing else matters. Could Bismarck have been designed differently to avoid this vulnerability? Possibly. Multiple rudders, redundant steering systems, and better protection for the rudder mechanism might have helped. But in 1941, most warships had similar vulnerabilities. The torpedo that hit Bismarck's rudder could have hit any ship in a similar way with similar results. Let's talk about the human element and command decisions. Admiral Lütjens has been criticized for several decisions during the operation, continuing south after the Denmark Strait battle, sending that fatal radio message, not attempting to return to Norway when it became clear reaching France would be difficult, but it's easy to criticize in hindsight. Lütjens was operating with incomplete information in a rapidly changing situation. He made reasonable decisions that turned out badly. That's war. The question is whether better decisions were available with the information he had at the time. Probably yes on the radio message. That was a clear operational security failure. Possibly yes to returning to Norway after the fuel damage. But the decision to continue toward France wasn't unreasonable given what he knew. The British command decisions were also critical. Churchill's personal involvement ensured that maximum resources were committed to the hunt. The decision to use aircraft from Ark Royal was crucial. The persistence in continuing the chase, even when Bismarck was temporarily lost, showed determination that paid off. But the British also had advantages that had nothing to do with decisions. They had more ships. They had better intelligence. They controlled bases on both sides of the Atlantic. Bismarck was operating in enemy-controlled waters from the start. That's a fundamental disadvantage that's hard to overcome with tactical brilliance. Let's consider another what-if. What if Bismarck hadn't been alone? The original plan called for the battleship Tirpitz to accompany Bismarck, but Tirpitz wasn't ready. What if she had been? Would two battleships have changed the outcome? Possibly. The British would have been more cautious about engaging two battleships with their lighter forces. The German ships could have protected each other, making it harder for aircraft to attack, but it also might not have mattered. The British still had overwhelming superiority in numbers. They could have brought enough force to overwhelm two German battleships just as they had overwhelmed one. The fundamental problem was strategic. Germany was unable to compete with British naval power in a sustained engagement. Commerce raiding only works if you can avoid the enemy's main forces. If you get caught, numbers matter. There's also the question of air power. The torpedo from Ark Royal's aircraft crippled Bismarck. This demonstrated that aircraft carriers were becoming the dominant naval weapon, even though few people fully realized it in 1941. If Germany had had carrier support for Bismarck, Could aircraft have protected her from British air attacks? Possibly, but Germany didn't have operational carriers. This was a strategic failure of German naval planning that couldn't be fixed at the tactical level. The British had carriers and Germany didn't, giving the British a decisive advantage in this type of operation. Let's examine the fuel situation more closely because this was the chain that dragged Bismarck down. The hit from the Prince of Wales ruptured a fuel tank, causing Bismarck to lose fuel and contaminate other tanks. This limited her range and dictated that she head for France. But how bad was the damage really? Some accounts suggest Bismarck lost access to about 1,000 tons of fuel. That's significant, but not necessarily fatal. The real problem was that the damaged tanks contaminated fuel oil in adjacent tanks, making even more fuel unusable. If Bismarck's designers had better compartmentalized the fuel system, the damage might have been more containable. This is hindsight, but it's a valid point. Design decisions made years before the operation created vulnerabilities that became critical during the mission. What if Bismarck had reached France? This is worth exploring because it almost came to pass. If that rudder-jamming torpedo had missed, Bismarck would have reached French ports in safety. What then? She'd be repaired, which would take weeks or months, depending on the extent of damage. Then what? She couldn't stay in France indefinitely. She'd have to return to Germany eventually, which meant running the British blockade again. And the British would be waiting with even more determination. So reaching France might have saved Bismarck temporarily, but it wouldn't have solved the strategic problem. As long as Bismarck was trapped in France, she couldn't return to Germany. She'd either have to attempt another breakout, likely ending in another chase, or be stuck in France for the duration of the war. Neither option is perfect. Some historians argue that Bismarck should never have been sent on the operation in the first place. The entire commerce raiding strategy was flawed, that Germany's few capital ships were too valuable to risk in the Atlantic, where British superiority would eventually corner them. This argument has merit. The destruction of Bismarck meant Germany lost one of its most powerful ships for minimal strategic gain. One British battlecruiser was sunk, Prince Eugen attacked some merchant ships before returning to port, and there was a disruption of British convoy schedules for a few days. In exchange, Germany lost the Bismarck and over 2,000 trained crew members. That's a terrible exchange rate. The risk wasn't worth the potential reward. But German naval planners in 1941 didn't have the luxury of hindsight. They were trying to use their limited naval assets to maximum effect. Commerce raiding was one of the few strategies available. Surface raiders had worked earlier in the war. The pocket battleship Graf Spee had caused chaos before being cornered. Other German ships had successfully raided Atlantic shipping. The plan for Bismarck wasn't crazy. It was risky, but potentially valuable. The execution just went wrong in multiple small ways that added up to disaster. Bad luck with the fuel hit, the fatal radio message. The torpedo hit the rudder. Any one of these going differently might have changed the outcome. Let's talk about the symbolism and psychological impact of Bismarck's sinking. For the British, Bismarck needed to be sunk. Hood had been a national icon, and her loss was a psychological blow that had to be avenged. The massive British response, pulling ships from conv, escorts and other duties, was driven partly by military necessity, but also by the need to restore British prestige and morale. Sinking Bismarck accomplished that. It showed that even Germany's most powerful ship could be hunted down and destroyed. It restored confidence in the Royal Navy at a time when British morale needed boosting. For Germany, the loss of Bismarck was equally symbolic. It demonstrated that surface raiders couldn't operate safely in the Atlantic against British naval superiority. After Bismarck, German naval strategy shifted more toward submarines. The surface fleet became less aggressive, more cautious. Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, spent most of the war in Norwegian fjords as a fleet in being, threatening Allied convoys but rarely venturing out. The loss of Bismarck essentially ended Germany's attempt to use capital ships for Atlantic operations. This was a strategic defeat that went beyond the loss of one ship. Could Bismarck have survived if everything had gone perfectly? Let's imagine the best-case scenario. Bismarck avoids the fuel hit in the Denmark Strait, or the hit happens but doesn't cause significant damage. She sinks Hood and escapes into the Atlantic. She avoids British detection through perfect operational security and good luck. She attacks several convoys, sinking dozens of merchant ships. Then she dashes back to Germany, evading British ships through speed and clever routing. She arrives home safely and becomes a hero. This scenario isn't impossible. It requires luck and good decisions at multiple points, but it could have happened. The fact that it didn't shows how difficult the operation was and how many things had to go right for success. But even in this best-case scenario, what has Germany gained? Some merchant ships were sunk, British convoy schedules disrupted, some damage to British morale, but Britain's merchant fleet numbered in the thousands of ships. Losing dozens wouldn't cripple Britain's imports, and the operation would have to be repeated to have a sustained strategic impact. Every time Bismarck or another capital ship sorties into the Atlantic, they risk the same fate that actually befell Bismarck. The fundamental problem remains. Germany can't win a sustained naval war against British numerical superiority. Commerce raiding with surface ships is a temporary expedient that can't achieve strategic victory. Only submarine warfare, which doesn't risk capital ships, can sustain pressure on British shipping. This brings us to the ultimate question. Was Bismarck doomed from the start? Not mechanically or tactically. The ship was capable, the crew was trained, the plan was reasonable, but strategically the operation was always going to struggle against British advantages in numbers, bases, and intelligence. Bismarck could succeed temporarily, but sustaining success would require either impossible luck or British incompetence. The British weren't incompetent, and luck is unreliable. So while specific decisions and events determined that Bismarck sank on May 27, 1941, the broader arc of her fate was probably inevitable once she entered the Atlantic against British opposition. The lessons from Bismarck's fate influenced naval warfare for decades. It demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful surface ships to air attack. It showed the importance of operational security and intelligence. It proved that numerical superiority and determination can overcome individual technical excellence. It illustrated that design vulnerabilities, like inadequate rudder protection, can be catastrophic. Modern warships incorporate lessons learned from Bismarck, including redundant steering, better compartmentalization, and recognition that aircraft and missiles are primary naval weapons rather than guns and armor. For the families and survivors, the sinking of Bismarck was a personal tragedy. Over 2,000 men died in the cold Atlantic. Many of them were young sailors who never wanted to be at war. They served their country and paid with their lives for decisions made by people they'd never met. The British sailors who fought against Bismarck respected their enemies' courage even as they destroyed their ship. There are accounts of British sailors who witnessed the sinking feeling, a mixture of relief at victory and sadness at the tremendous loss of life. War makes enemies of people who might otherwise have been friends. That's part of its tragedy. So could Bismarck have survived? Mechanically, yes, if several things had gone differently. Strategically, probably not in the long term. The ship could have escaped the specific chase that led to her sinking. Different decisions, better luck, and she makes it to France or back to Germany. But then what? She's still a German capital ship in a war where Britain controls the seas. She'd either be stuck in port or risk destruction in another sortie. The fate that befell her in May 1941 would likely have found her eventually in some other form. The real question isn't whether Bismarck could have survived, it's whether the entire strategy of using her was sound. And the answer history provides is no. Germany's capital ships were too few and too valuable to risk against British numerical superiority. Their destruction was inevitable if they were used aggressively, and their inactivity was useless if they were preserved cautiously. Bismarck was caught in this strategic trap, with no escape. If this deep dive into one of naval history's most dramatic chases gave you a new perspective on the hunt for Bismarck, hit that like button and subscribe. We're exploring the what-ifs and might-have-beens of World War II, the decisions that changed outcomes, the moments where history hung in the balance. Don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and remember, in war, the best ship and the bravest crew can still lose to bad luck and superior numbers.